Whenever we test web pages, we need to interact with CSS selectors. That is true of LiveView, as well as more traditional end-to-end testing libraries like Wallaby and Hound. So in this lesson, I want to talk about which CSS selectors to target in our tests to make our tests resilient to change. So let's first talk briefly about what CSS selectors are, and then we'll talk about choosing good CSS selectors for our tests. Now, I'm on a particular branch, and I want you to check that out even if you haven't made it that far yet. This just gives us a good starting point for looking at the CSS selectors on the HTML, but won't be changing any of the functionality. So, what are CSS selectors? CSS selectors are a pattern of an element and other terms, so imagine h1 and then a CSS class, that tell the browser which element to apply styles to. So they're used for CSS, which is why they're called CSS selectors, but they're also a great way for our tests to target elements on a page. Let's take a look at what types of CSS selectors or what terms are valid in a CSS selector. Go ahead and open up a Scratchpad, or at least I'm going to open up one just to talk about these things, and then we'll look at code in a second. So we can have type selectors or element selectors, something like h1 or div, things like that. We also have class selectors, so things like users, posts. This is probably things you've seen before, they're more familiar. We have ID selectors, something like perhaps this is the username on the page, and ID selectors should be unique on a given page. And then we get into perhaps some more obscure CSS selectors, which are something like attribute selectors. So if you have an element on a page, imagine an anchor tag that has an href, we could target the href with a given string. For example, maybe this is some path in your app that you know should be in there. So you could target that anchor tag with that href. There's also pseudo classes that can be helpful. So if you're trying to target a disabled element, you can target something like disabled. So for example, maybe you're trying to find an input that's disabled, right? So you could do something like this. And then there's also checked for that if you're interested in that. They can come in handy when you're dealing with tests and you want to make sure something's checked. Finally, there's ways to combine these selectors. So two in particular I want to highlight are the descendant selector. So for example, if we want to find an element with a class of user inside a div tag, we can add a space, right? And this means it's anywhere inside that div tag. We could also say we need the user element. It's an immediate child of that div, and that's the child selector. So you can pass something like that. There's a lot more to be learned here, and I will include two great resources in the notes. There's the MDN's guide on CSS selectors and the W3C's selectors guide. So feel free to look at those. There's a whole lot more, but I want to highlight these because these tend to be the things I use, and I want to now see them in practice. So let's go ahead and launch a server. And what we'll do is open up our post component. We're going to throw a little style tag in the middle of the HTML, and we're going to just target a few elements and make sure that we understand how these work. So go ahead and open up post component. And at the top of the render, let's go ahead and throw a style tag so we can add some styles in there. I'm going to go ahead and refresh my page here so my app loads. All right. So let's walk through those selectors we talked about. Let's say we want to target an H1 in this page, and let's just give it a border. It can be 2 pixels, and we're going to make it solid and red. Right? So now we see that we're targeting that element, and this may be familiar to you. We're targeting a type of element, right? So that could be a div, or it could be an image, an anchor tag, things like that. We can also target a given class selector. So suppose we want to target all posts, and that targets every single post on the page. And you see that class, we actually have it right here. All right, let's look at an ID selector. So I'm going to go ahead and open the inspector here and find out what post ID we have here. So this is post-37 in my computer. Make sure you check yours because it could be a different ID. And if you look at that, that's what we're defining right here, a post ID. So I'll go ahead and target that post based on its ID. Excellent. And now only that post is highlighted. So we're targeting that correctly. Now let's consider an attribute selector. So suppose I want to target all of the, let's see, the like counts where we have a data role, right? So I could go ahead and target those on the page. So I'll go ahead and go back up here, and we can use an attribute selector by saying data role. like count. Perfect. So you see them, they're getting targeted right there. Now, we won't test out disabled and check things because we don't have those right now over here. But what I want to consider next is let's take a look at combining these. So I think this is pretty powerful. We can target a specific post. So post 37 is the ID we had found. So we want to target the post, and anywhere in that post, we want to find this data role of like count. So rather than targeting all of the like counts, we're going to target only that one, right? So I'll save this, and sure enough, we can target that. Perfect. Now let's talk about how to choose CSS selectors to target elements on our tests. When we're targeting CSS selectors, or when we're targeting elements on our tests, we want to keep in mind that we're not the only people in our team who will be using these HTML elements and these attributes on pages. That means there are reasons why our HTML might change that are entirely unrelated to our test. So the question we want to answer, or the question we want to ask ourselves is, which changes should break our test and which shouldn't, right? So the answer varies based on what we're trying to ensure with our test, but I think these 4 things are typically true. First, changing the styling of our page or of our elements should not break our tests. Usually that's an implementation detail that we are not concerned about. Changing the structure of the page should not break our test. For example, what if we had defined this postcard, the timeline postcard, as a table, and then we change it as a div and we add grid or flexbox? Well, that shouldn't change our test because we don't have to rely on it being a table and a table row and a table data. Rather, we're trying to rely on the fact that that is a component of sorts. Number 3, changing the position of our element within the page should probably not break our test. Now, that's not always true because there are some times when we want to make sure that a given element is in a given position. So sometimes this could be a reason why our test should break, but most of the times it's not. Now, removing the element from the page should definitely break our test. So this is the one scenario that I do think should break our test. So if someone comes in and removes that element, our test should fail because, well, we don't have that element anymore. So our test is now failing because it's asserting something is present when it isn't. So the list is not exhaustive, but that's what I want you to be thinking about when choosing CSS selectors to target in your tests. Ask yourself, when would my test break if I use this CSS selector? For the reasons I just mentioned, my preferred approach is to target specific elements with IDs, since they're supposed to be unique on a single page, and then use data attributes, in particular I like data roles, that have semantic meaning. That means they have meaning outside of just your test, to target those elements that might be repeated on the page. So for example, we saw here the like count. In fact, let's go ahead and erase this and take a look at one of our tests. Open up the timeline live test. And the last test we have here is the one where we're targeting the like count for a particular post right here. If you notice, we're doing exactly the same thing we did when we were targeting CSS selectors just a second ago. We're targeting a specific ID, and inside that post, we want to make sure that that like count has a given number. Let me open this up a little bit so we have more real estate. So as you can see, we're targeting an ID, and I like that because we know that that'll uniquely identify the post on the page. Then we use a descendant selector, so this space in between the two. And we do this rather than a child selector because we don't particularly care where the like count is relative to the top level of the card. And finally, we use a data role because we're trying to rely on something that is unlikely to change for other reasons. For example, we could have actually targeted this test with a class. There was a class that is right next to this data role called post action count. And we could have targeted that and the test would have passed, but the problem is, what if someone comes and changes that post action count to like count, a class, because we're changing CSS, we're changing the styling, that kind of thing, and then that would break our test. So this is what I prefer. Now let's run through some potential alternative implementations to make sure that this is the best way to do it. For example, we could, instead of using this, I'll just drop this over here. So this is the current implementation. Instead of using this, we could have targeted perhaps a div with the same data role. Of course, there's a problem here that the div is not specific, but in addition to that, the problem of the div is that if we change that div to a span or a table or something else, it would break our tests even though from the behavior perspective, nothing's changed, and so our test should not fail. Now, we could also do something like this, where we use the ID, but we use the CSS selector, like I mentioned, so post action count, right? So this would actually pass the test, but the problem is, once again, that if someone changes the post action count to like count, then our test breaks, when technically it shouldn't, because nothing in the behavior has changed, it's just the style. Finally, we could use a child selector, so we could use a post action and target the post action count that way. But if someone were to add one more div or a span in between the post action element and the post action count, our test would break. So I don't recommend using child selectors that much because there's too much specificity as the relative location of one element versus the other. So my rule of thumb is use IDs when we can identify something uniquely on the page, and then use semantic data roles or some other data attribute. I've seen people use data ID, test ID kind of things, to zoom in on a specific element you're targeting. And you can use descendant combinators to target an otherwise common element in a unique component. That's it for this lesson. Thank you so much to Eduardo for suggesting I cover CSS selectors. I hope this was helpful, and I'll see you all on the next lesson.